Hello and welcome to COVID and You, a special programme that we've put together here at Access Radio, looking at one particular aspect of the coronavirus pandemic, people's mental health. We now know a great deal about the physical health problems that have been caused by the virus and how to treat them, but what's still not clear is the effects of the pandemic on our mental health. The consequences of months of isolation, uncertainty and fear that may continue for years after the virus has gone. So at Access, we decided to put together this short programme to look at the various aspects of this area and also to provide some advice and direction for people too. My name is Steve Parry and I'm joined in the studio by counsellor Mary Figgis, who will be bringing her expert advice and input. Thank you for joining us, Mary.
Thanks, Steve. It's great to be here.
And one of the things that we did to try and gauge the different sorts of problems that people were going through was to produce a survey. As we're based in Stoke-on-Trent, that survey was sent out to people in the North Staffordshire area, and we looked at those survey results with Mary so we could pick out some of the main themes that people were facing in relation to their mental health. We'll be talking about those various themes as we make our way through the programme. And the first theme we will look at is perhaps the most obvious one, given the lockdowns and social distancing that we've all had to go through, and that is the theme of isolation. We spoke to some of the people who've been involved in our research and got them to share what they've been going through. In a few moments we'll hear from Joe and Amy, but first of all, let's hear Anna's perspective.
Well, what a shocker. Very strange, very limiting and sort of surreal. That was how I felt. Luckily, I'm very self-contained, quite happy with my own company type of girl, which was a good thing because I just carried on as I always have. But missing the human contact, the social interaction with other people, including, most importantly, my own family, has been very hard.
I think the main thing I've missed is I'm a bit of a social creature, especially when it sort of comes to working as well. Sort of everything I've done up to this point has been collaborative. I quite like the dynamic of bouncing ideas off people or things like that, and that's sort of gone out the window. So although I've had a lot of time to sort of get on with things, I think at this point in time it sort of feels a bit like Groundhog Day. A lack of... I think the first lockdown wasn't so bad because I could sort of make art and music and things about it, but then now it's sort of lockdown 3 now, and I've sort of run out of ideas.
It wasn't so great at the beginning. It was all very unpredictable and scary, and like a lot of people, I was very unsure about what was going to happen and quite anxious about a lot of things. But and then kind of after about 6 weeks just sitting in the house thinking, I'd realised some areas of my life that definitely did need to change, and one of those was that I felt quite disconnected from people, pretty lonely, as it were. So I did take some steps to be able to try to change that and bring together an old group of friends that hadn't been as close in recent years and so forth.
The voices of Joe, Amy and Anna there. Incidentally, worthwhile pointing out that those names are not necessarily the real names of the people involved in the survey. Mary, as you have read through the survey responses, what did you kind of pick up in this whole area of isolation?
Firstly, that isolation is very, very common. I think all of us have felt isolated during the lockdowns. And isolation is connected to loneliness. Loneliness is a symptom of isolation. And that has come through very clearly through the surveys. So loneliness has been likened to having the same effect on the body as a chronic illness, such as diabetes or smoking 15 cigarettes a day. It is a huge problem in our society, even before the lockdown, and it is known as the Silent Epidemic.
It's interesting, as Amy pointed out, that going into lockdown made her realise that there were connections that she kind of had, but also didn't have as well. They were there, but they were almost dormant. And hearing her response of kind of reconnect those people, because I suppose we've all got those people that we haven't seen for a while, and we don't realise they're not there until we get to a situation like that. And so hearing what she said about basically reconnecting those, maybe other people were a bit embarrassed or just thought, or they won't want to talk to me, that's a really positive way of looking at it, isn't it?
It is, and research has shown that when one is lonely, it is harder to reach out to others because of the loneliness feeling.
Now, that leads us on to a related area, because isolation and loneliness, as you've already said, are very closely connected. Let's hear from Joe, who is a musician, as he talks on that subject.
There is a slight sense of normalisation to it now, which I'm not comfortable with at all. I'm still waiting for the day that we're allowed out again. But it's definitely, it doesn't feel normal. It doesn't feel normal. It feels there's a sense of sort of chicken coop, lab rat type of thing that I think sort of like it's. I think that's the thing that sort of gets me down about it, or there'll be days where it is that loss of human contact. We are social animals, social beings, and it is quite isolating, But before the lockdown, it would have been a case of I'd love some time on my own. It'd be great to get away and concentrate on whatever project you're working on. But then I think when it's not a choice, when you're not doing it by choice, it's sort of a entirely different kettle of fish, really. I thought I'd get more done, I thought I'd be perhaps more productive, but I think that element of being able to share ideas and get feedback on things, and I just don't think the Zoom calls cut it. I don't think it's a very limited way of communicating. I think a lot of things get said or through body language, and that's gone with a Zoom call, or even the flow of the conversation is somewhat stunted or staggered because you're waiting for a connection, or somebody's dog starts barking, or whatever, whatever it is.
Now, that's a really interesting aspect that Joe has brought into the conversation there, because in many ways we've not been short of communication during lockdown. We've had plenty of that. Well, many people have. Some people have found it to be more literally isolated than others. But it just brings into play this concept that Joe was talking about there, that just because you are not alone, you might be in a house full of people, doesn't mean that you can't be lonely.
Absolutely, yes. That is so true. And that sense of loneliness and disconnection makes it harder to reach out to others. But some of the helpful tips for loneliness, when you do spend a lot of time on your own, is to break up the day with having a routine. It does make the day go quicker. For example, taking a little walk, reading, phoning a friend, puzzles, set little goals for yourself, and think about someone else who may appreciate a call or a visit in their garden. Focusing on someone else can really help our feelings of loneliness, and in turn helps someone else who may well be feeling lonely.
That's excellent advice, and even things now, because I get days like that as well, thinking actually how can I do that, and I put that into practice too. Another common theme that came out from the survey was some of the issues that had followed on from the whole area of disconnection into more serious areas like depression. Let's hear the experiences of Dave on this subject.
It's been hard, actually, the last 12 months. Very hard, just to, trying to work things out, trying to do this, go there, can't go here, because I've got COPD and locked down. So it's like you're confined. So I've been getting quite depressed, upset at times, and not understanding it. I've been going through loads of different emotions and loads of things all around me, Strange, actually. Strange things I've never understood. But then again, I suppose that's lockdown.
Those are the thoughts of Dave, who took part in our project. Mary, was that quite a common feeling amongst the survey results?
Yes, again, the increase of depression, I think that came through very strongly in the survey. It's very, very hard to motivate yourself with depression. As you've heard from the clips, people can feel very low, unhappy, despondent, and deep sadness, despair and hopelessness.
How do you advise people who almost find that events have caused them to drift into negative emotions like this?
So, again, some helpful tips for living with depression is to set small, manageable goals, to be realistic with your goals, so that you don't feel that you've let yourself down or that you've not succeeded. Being creative in depression is such a help. So anything that you enjoy doing creatively, gently push yourself, because with depression it is very hard to motivate yourself, and the temptation to sit in a chair all day can be very, very strong. I really recommend talking to a trusted friend who will listen and not try to rescue you or fix you, but simply to be there to listen to you. And exercise has been proven to be very good for depression. So choose something that you enjoy, because you're more likely to keep it up. It increases the serotonin in the brain. And something, if you've got a garden and you enjoy it, that is amazing exercise too.
Let's move on to another aspect that we saw reflected in the survey. We have had lots of shortages of everything over the last 12 to 18 months, but one thing that hasn't been in short supply has been uncertainty, particularly when we think back to the start of the pandemic. Absolutely nobody knew how this was going to go. That had quite an effect on people in the form of anxiety. We'll hear from Anna in a moment, but first here's Dave again giving his thoughts on the subject.
It's been quite difficult not knowing what's going to happen next, because you're hearing one thing, then you're hearing another thing, and you don't know what's going to happen. And you're thinking, what is going on here? So you're confused, which doesn't help at all, does it? But it's actually the lockdown. It's brought loads of stuff. Confusion, your mind going all over the place. And like I say, depression. That's bad.
At home, it's been like I've been in a convent, because there's been nothing going on, all social interaction, all the coffee mornings that we were having and the chats have only been very tiny now. We haven't been allowed to do just normal things, obviously. Plus, where I live, it's sheltered housing, but we're very independent, and everybody has felt the stress and the anxiety concerning daily living, what to do, where to go, and all the sudden changes. We found it very difficult as people over 55 towards 90. We've found it very difficult to cope with these sudden changes from the government.
Anna talking there about how the endless changes we've had over the last year or so have made her feel, and we saw that coming up a lot in the survey, didn't we?
Yes, indeed. Anxiety is a very common issue that a lot of people live with, and the lockdown and the restrictions have made anxiety a lot more prevalent and worse for people. So you may be feeling overwhelmed by life's problems and feeling stressed in your everyday life. Anxiety can also bring on panic attacks, which can be very distressing and debilitating.
Anxiety is a strange thing because there are some things that make some people anxious and yet other people aren't affected by those things at all. If people are more predisposed to this than others, how do people handle that?
So again, some helpful tips that can help you deal and live with anxiety. For example, being creative, just like in loneliness, it can be extremely helpful. So find something you enjoy. It could be colouring in, painting, making cards, puzzles, knitting, baking. These are just a few examples. Creativity is calming and therapeutic in itself. For general anxiety, a few tips could be to think, what is the worst that can happen? Very often we catastrophize our thoughts in our minds due to our anxieties and fears, and we listen to those thoughts. Breathing is a very helpful tip, especially for panic attacks. So controlled breathing. Try breathing in for 4 seconds, holding it and breathing out for 4 seconds, and that will help to still the fearful and anxious thoughts going on in your mind.
Another common theme that we've discovered that is related to anxiety, I suppose, is a feeling of people being overwhelmed, reacting to the pressures that have come up during the pandemic in a different way than they would have expected. We'll hear from Amy and Dave in a moment, but first of all, here's Lily telling us what her experience has been.
Well, terrible, really terrible, because I've had nobody much. I've had 2 or 3 neighbours that have been good, but I don't mind trouble too much because I'm independent, so I've been really stuck. And I've seen nobody. All my friends are really fed up. And I just feel, I'm going to be truthful now, that life wasn't worth living. Oh, terrible. That's all I can say, really. It's true, because I'm on my own 7 days a week.
Things have been brought to the surface that I didn't know were there in the first place. You know, things you thought, ooh, I thought I'd dealt with that. But with being on lockdown, you realise you haven't dealt with it. The personal point of view, and, you know, different things, it's just different emotions, and emotions you've not experienced, really. But it's that sense of separation from people.
Yeah, but it was very much an exaggeration of problems that already existed. It wasn't really a situation that was caused by the pandemic. Once you've had 6 weeks at home alone with your own thoughts, that you kind of realise these things.
It's really interesting hearing how people's responses to the pressures of the pandemic have not been quite what they expect, and I guess that's the feeling of being overwhelmed and then unexpected emotions and things coming up. Now, the feeling of being overwhelmed is quite closely related to anxiety, isn't it?
It is, yes. A lot of these feelings, like anxiety, feeling overwhelmed, are connected very closely to one another. And also, I'd like to talk a little bit about suicidal thoughts, as one of the people in the survey spoke about. When we have suicidal thoughts, we can feel hopeless, a great sense of despair, overwhelmed by negative thoughts or circumstances. We might feel useless and desperate, like taking our life might be the only option.
The whole area of suicide is such a sensitive subject that people might not feel comfortable with even talking about the idea of things that they can do to address those kind of thoughts. But there are approaches and things that people can look at, aren't there?
Yes, there are. Firstly, please know that you're not alone. Many people struggle with suicidal thoughts. So my first tip would be talk to someone, whether professional or a trusted friend. And as hard as it is to feel right now, people mostly recover from suicidal thoughts. You're not alone in it. And do resist the temptation to pretend that everything is all right. Don't berate yourself or think you're being silly for having suicidal thoughts. You really are not. These thoughts do have their roots in something, for example, depression, loneliness, trauma, post-traumatic stress disorder, abuse or bullying. The pandemic will have exasperated all of these. So getting and seeking help by talking these things through will help.
Of course, during the pandemic, many people have suffered loss. That's been another common theme as we've been looking through our survey responses, and that's been made worse by not being able to see people. We're going to hear from Anna's experience of that in a moment, but as we read our survey responses, we also saw that loss was not just about bereavement. Here's some thoughts from Joe again. As Joe is a student, we asked him about how younger people have been affected.
And I know it must be much more difficult for them, because it's sort of, that's their whole social life, especially if they're sort of away from home. And, it's sort of that first step into the adult world, isn't it, I guess. I can think back to the sort of first time at university. It was half and half, half study, half the social aspect of things. And I can't imagine sort of the difficulties that presents. I know my sister's 18 at the moment, and 19 actually. She's 19 the other day. And now she spent her 18th birthday with her mum and dad, which is, I can't imagine many 18-year-olds want to spend their 18th birthday with a mum and dad. And then her 19th birthday she spent with her mum and dad as well. So she's had 2 years of, I guess, not being able to do the things that you normally expect a sort of young adult teenager to be getting up to. And I feel ever so sorry for her. I think just the opportunity for moments to arise, or situations to arise, has gone. Whether that's a holiday, or going to see a gig, or a theatre show, or whatever. Those things that you sort of do spark ideas off. I was a regular at most pubs in Stoke-on-Trent, I think, before lockdown. So just that those off-chance conversations you have, or off-chance meetings you have, they seem to have dried up, which is a massive shame. Yeah.
The day that the COVID dropped was the last day that I saw my dear sister, and then just all we had was phone conversations. Then it went down to texts, and she sadly passed away without me seeing her for 6 months, and we were very, very close. Plus the funeral was horrendous because we could only go and have a really small funeral, 14 people, which was ridiculous because my sister had hundreds of friends. She was a very popular person, very kind, good-hearted.
I was climbing the walls to be able to get out and see people, and then I did see them in August and what have you last year when we were able to, and then the time since then, in the November lockdown, and then the current one that's just starting to ease, I've had a much different outlook, and I've been trying really hard to use this as a blank slate to build the life that I want, not just endless periods of time where you're watching the clock tick, which what part of the first one very much was.
The thoughts of Amy there, finishing off that section about how people have dealt with this whole area of loss. Our counsellor Mary is with me in the studio. And Mary, going back to Joe's comment about young people, I suppose some people listening to that might be quite dismissive about it and just say, oh, it's just FOMO, the fear of missing out. But actually, it's not just the fear of missing out. This is the reality of missing out. It's not just something that's going on. It's being kind of marooned at home with mum and dad, as he used in his example of his sister there, when actually you should be going out and meeting people and having fun and things like that. How do people deal with that?
So, yes, I completely agree with you. The reality of missing out, which brings along symptoms of loss and grief. And I think people can really underestimate the reality of grief on our minds and on our bodies. For example, symptoms of grief could be difficulty with breathing, especially in the beginning, dry mouth, mental fogginess, tearfulness, insomnia, a hollow feeling in the tummy, difficulty concentrating, extreme sadness, and feeling intensely vulnerable and fragile and not being able to cope with much or extra pressures. And even aches and pains. So we mustn't underestimate the reality of loss on people's lives due to the pressures and the effects of the lockdown.
Amy spoke there about how she approached this issue in terms of saying, actually, I'm not going to see it so much as loss as a blank sheet to actually start doing new things. Is that a good approach, or are there other ways of looking at it as well?
Yeah, I think it's good to look at it positively if you can, in terms of loss and grief, because a lot of people have lost loved ones due to COVID, and the only way is through. There is no way round grief, and my advice is to go with it. It has a mind of its own, and I think it's best just to go with it. When you feel like crying, to cry. I liken grief to the waves of the sea. Sometimes the tide is out and other times the tide is in. Don't fight your grief, and go with it.
Excellent stuff. Now, before we move on, I just must make one clarification about Joe's comment to being a regular at every pub in Stoke-on-Trent. Just to clarify, as I mentioned earlier on, Joe is a musician, so that's why he's been to so many pubs in Stoke-on-Trent. Just thought I'd clarify that in case anybody listening spots Joe's voice and thinks, I know him. But anyway, finally, as we head towards the end of our programme, we want to spend some time looking at the positives. One thing that we were really intrigued about as we looked at the survey was that there were a number of positive emotional feelings that had come through this whole situation we've had for the last 12 to 18 months. Here's Anna again.
On the positive, 2 babies have been conceived in the COVID in my family, and that has been a happy thing. The positive things are, it makes everyone who's got a brain cell appreciate what's the most important things, not materialistic, but your family, and keeping everything going as best you can, which most people have tried to, and supporting each other where possible. And I've read 40 books since the COVID dropped, and I've done sewing, I've had a sewing machine, and I've done a lot of cooking, and I've just been peaceful with God's help in myself.
Mary, some people have obviously found the pandemic easier to deal with than others. It was interesting though, wasn't it, that some people found positives from the whole experience?
Yes, indeed. And I think that it is very important to look upon the positives of our lives as well as the difficulties, so that we don't our lives don't become out of balance. It is much easier to look on the negatives of any situation. That is human nature. But it really does help us to look at the positives and to be thankful. I think thankfulness is incredibly important, even for little things like a roof over our head or food enough to eat. Things like that can really lift us when we're feeling very low.
Well, that just about brings us to the end of our time today. Mary, you've been offering us thoughts and advice throughout the programme. And in many ways, there's been common themes in your hints and tips and things like that to deal with the variety of different emotions that people are experiencing. Why don't you just finish off by summing up the main points that we've covered in that respect?
Okay, to sum up what we've said, really having a routine to our day, having structure to our day is very important and will make the days go quicker, especially if we're depressed or lonely. Exercise, the benefits of exercise. Creativity is so important and is therapeutic in and of itself. Find someone trusted that you can talk to, and staying positive and being thankful.
Mary Figgis, thank you so much for spending the time with us today. It's been really enlightening.
Thank you for having me. I've enjoyed it.
There is just one more thing to mention before we go. Because of the significant input into this programme from people who are in and around Stoke-on-Trent, I'm sure many residents there will be listening. I do hope that what we've talked about has been helpful to you, but if you need more information, there is a local mental health helpline number that has been set up for the residents of North Staffordshire. That is well worth mentioning here. The number is 01 782 234 233. That's 01 782 234 233. That is the number to access the mental health helpline 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, based in North Staffordshire. Well, that is all that we have time for in the programme, so it is time for me, Steve Perry, to say goodbye for now, and also to say that this has been an Access Media production in partnership with the Department of Culture, Media and Sport and the National Lottery's Local Connections Fund.